When I first started out as a software engineer, I missed my first chance at making millions of dollars. Now, it turned out to be a good thing, just not financially. For the rest of this video, I'm going to tell you the story about what happened and how. Hi, I'm John Miller, the Deliberate Engineer. Over the last 30 years, I worked in big tech and a variety of other places, Microsoft, Google, Amazon, and so on, as a software engineer. Over those years, I accumulated lots of hopefully entertaining stories that also have some lessons for you if you're a software engineer, maybe just entertainment if you're not. My first full-time job as a software engineer when I got out of school was working at Microsoft. I joined in summer of 1991 as a software engineer on the Windows NT team. I was a software engineer in test. Now, at that time, anybody who joined Microsoft got a mixture of compensation. They'd get some sort of salary, there'd possibly be bonuses, but the lion's share of your compensation came in the form of something called stock options. If you're not familiar with a stock option, it's sort of a contract that gives you the right to buy a share of stock or a certain number of shares of stock at a fixed price. So for example, let's say that I get a stock option to buy Microsoft stock at $100 a share. If the stock goes down, well, I probably wouldn't use that option because I'd just be paying more than the shares are worth. But let's say that the stock goes up to $120 a share. Well, in that case, for every share that I exercised the contract on, I would get $20 of profit because I was paying $100 for $120 of stock. At that point, I could decide whether I want to sell the stock altogether and just keep that $20 of profit, or whether I want to hold on to it for a while. Anyways, that's roughly how stock options work. Stock options were an extremely popular form of compensation at software companies in the 80s and the 90s. The tax story for them and the income reporting story for them was a little bit up in the air, so there was actually financial advantage to a company to give stock options rather than stock awards to their employees, and so most of them did. At the time that I joined Microsoft, they were just starting their meteoric rise in terms of the value of the stock. During the 90s, there was a phenomenon called Microsoft Millionaires, which said basically that people who were working at Microsoft and had stock options, so many of them were becoming millionaires, it was ridiculous. I think I saw an estimate of more than 1,000 Microsoft employees being millionaires before the year 2000 even hit. That's how prevalent it was, and it was in media everywhere, if you're old enough to have been reading the media at that time. When I first joined Microsoft in early summer of 1991, I was given 2,000 options to buy Microsoft stock at the current price, which I think was somewhere around $90, $100 a share. What that meant was it was absolutely worthless at that time, but if the stock went up in price, then those options could potentially become very valuable. While I was spending pretty much all of my time in my life working on Windows NT at Microsoft, the stock was continuing to climb up. So in the 2.5 years that I was there, the stock split twice, each time a 3-to-2 split. When that happens, what it means is instead of, for example, having 2,000 shares, or options for 2,000 shares, now I have options for 3,000 shares. And instead of them being $90 a share for the option, it turns into $60 a share for the option. So now every dollar that the stock goes up earns me $3,000 instead of $2,000. Splits are good, and they mean that you have a much higher upside potential. By the time I left Microsoft in the summer of 1993, the initial 2,000 option grant I had grown to 4,500 options, and the strike price had dropped down to about $44. So if you do the math, if I'd had access to all those options, it would have been worth about $140,000. The way the stock options worked, they were granted to you, and then they vested. In other words, you got access to a certain fraction of them over the next 4.5 years. I left after 2.5 years, which meant that I only had access to, I think, 25% of the stock options. So that was, I think, about $30,000. It was nice, it let me pay off my student loans, but it certainly wasn't enough to get rich. And in fact, it barely made up for the below industry level wages that I and lots of other people like me at Microsoft were being paid at the time. I think when I joined Microsoft, I was making a little over $30,000 a year. And when I left in 1993, I was making probably under $40,000 a year. So that extra bump, it was sort of like a forced savings plan. Not awful, it was nice, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't millions and millions of dollars. So why did I leave Microsoft? Well, that's actually a much bigger story. I'll tell part of that story a little later on in this video, but I want to talk about how funny and how circular life can be. So 4 years after I left Microsoft and moved to Pittsburgh, I wound up coming back. So I joined Microsoft full-time again in November of 1997, just a little more than 4 years after I left. Now by that point, the stock had split a few more times, and if I'd had those original shares that were granted to me, those original options, when I first joined in 1991, they would have been worth $2.3 million. Of course, I didn't have them. They gave me new stock when I joined, new stock options, but the strike price was set to the current price, and it was a lot fewer options than I would have had otherwise. Meanwhile, my friends who joined at about the same time I did in 91 and were still working at the company, most of them were multimillionaires, owing to the rapid growth of the stock. So good for them. Over the next couple years, the stock continued to split and grow and grow. And by the time we got to near the end of 1999, things were actually looking really good. Even the new stock options that I'd been granted were worth several $100,000, so I was smiling my way out of the way of the bank. This was all virtual money. I hadn't actually bought anything yet, but it was money that I felt good, and I wanted to see it keep doubling just like it had up to that point. And then along came the dot-com bust. Now, if you guys don't know about this, there was a big sort of land rush for internet companies in the mid to late 90s. It got overinvested in, and then there was a financial crisis and a lack of confidence in those dot-coms in the early 2000s, 2000, 2001. As a consequence, stock prices dropped dramatically, including Microsoft stock prices. Suddenly, all the shares that I had in the second time at Microsoft were underwater. In other words, it would have actually cost me more to buy the stock using those options than they were worth. This is something that never changed for the next 10 years. So that money was just gone, which is a shame. But, you know, that's life. By then, Microsoft was paying its engineers much better than it had been earlier on, so the salary and bonus alone were more than enough to be a happy employee in terms of the financial compensation. Still, how much would those original options have been worth if I just joined in 91 and then magically knew to sell them all off at the end of 1999? The answer is $6.3 million. So this was the first time that I blew my chance at being a multi-millionaire by deciding not to stick around. Ironically, it's not the only time I did that. I'll tell that story another time. It happened while I was at CMU. But this time, I definitely could feel that money, but the decision that I made to leave, I still feel like that was a great decision for me personally. So let's roll back to 1991 and 1993. By mid-1993, I was pretty burned out on Microsoft. I'd been working 6 or 7 days a week, really hard, and I just felt like I was selling my youth for money. And there would always be more money in the world, hopefully, but I wouldn't be this young again. You know, as a 25, 26-year-old guy, you start wondering, well, you know, by the time I'm 35, I'm going to be ancient. Not necessarily, but that's what I thought back then. So when my girlfriend, who I met during an internship that she had at Microsoft, wound up going to graduate school at Carnegie Mellon University, I decided to leave Microsoft, take some time off of being a heavy-duty software engineer, and instead work in the computer science department at CMU as a software engineer. The great things about working at CMU, first of all, I got to follow the girl that I was in love with at the time, and I didn't have to give that up for money and make this sort of choice for, you know, purely greedy reasons. Secondly, I was getting to go to CMU, one of the 2 best computer science schools in the US, and I was allowed to take classes for free. So suddenly I could take some graduate computer science classes at CMU and really see, is this something I could have done? You know, how smart, how good am I compared to the other people at CMU? So that was sort of priceless to me. As well, I got to do some other things that I never had the time or the ability to do when I was working full-time at Microsoft. I'd been sort of an amateur writer when I was in college, and I really wanted to try writing bigger things. I'd written a book in college that was awful, never got published, but you know, that was the level of interest I had. I could actually sit down and write stories that were 10 pages or 100 pages or 300 pages. So I joined a writers group, and I learned an awful lot about writing and about accepting criticism and using it to improve what I was writing, which has served me very well since then. It turns out I am not a commercial quality author, but I really enjoyed getting the chance to try that out. Also, I worked on producing shareware and freeware. These are both things that I wanted to do to see if I could make my own fortune by selling software I wrote. The first program I wrote was something called Puzzler, which used Bezier curves and let you take any picture that you had and make it into a jigsaw puzzle of sort of arbitrary size and then move it around on the screen and so on. Pretty common sort of program, but still I was proud of the one that I made and I was very happy with it. And I got to learn lots about shareware and how much money you do or don't make on releasing your own software. The second piece of software that I made was for a game called Mud. I made a port of a Tintin client, and I made what's called a VT100 emulator for Windows NT. This allowed you to have cursor movement in console windows. It may sound silly, but it was actually quite useful at the time, and I didn't see another one out there. I released both of those, and a fair number of people used them. So I got to sort of scratch that itch of releasing my own software and find out, yeah, well, you know, I can do it, but I'm not so good at it that it's going to support me for the rest of my life. That, the school, and getting to find out that the woman I was with at the time, you know, wasn't the one for me in the long term, all that was definitely worth it. If I'd stayed at Microsoft and if I had access to all that money, and if I'd felt like I was selling my soul for that money, I think it would have absolutely destroyed me. And on my way down, I would have destroyed all the people around me. So in my mind, it's really very lucky that I made that decision, that I was able to go and work at CMU and kind of get a chance to regroup and reassess my priorities in the way that I did things, so that the next time I went back to Microsoft, I was in a much better headspace for it. And so there you have it, the story of the first time that I missed being a millionaire. Not the last time, but certainly the first time. I hope you found the story entertaining. I'm happy to answer questions about it if you have any. If you want to call me a fool, that's fine too. Go ahead and leave comments down below. And if you found the story entertaining and want to hear more things like it, why don't you go ahead and leave a like for this video and subscribe so that I have that feedback that says, yes, this is what we like. And as always, keep on pushing forward.